They said no one ever stood up to the HOA. But I was not just anyone that morning. I woke up to a letter folded too neatly, almost smug in its perfect creases, a letter that would try to tell me what I could and could not do in my own backyard. My hands shook not from fear, but from something far older, a quiet burn that had been waiting for a spark. The paper felt heavier than it should, like the weight of rules made by people who never asked how we actually lived. I could hear the faint hum of lawnmowers somewhere down the street, smell the sweet sharp smoke from a neighbor 2 houses away. But here in my hands was the reason those simple moments might end forever. It started with a barbecue, just a few friends, some music that felt like summer, even in early spring, and the smell of ribs slow cooking in the pit. I had spent years perfecting my setup, the grill, the smoker, the way the chairs circled the table so conversation felt easy, not forced. People laughed, they leaned back in their seats, they told stories like the night had no curfew. And for a while I believed this neighborhood could feel like home. But then I saw them, the 2 HOA board members, standing at the far edge of my fence. They wore that look you get when you are not here to join the party, but to measure it, judge it, maybe end it. I waved once, they did not wave back. The next day the letter came, neat, polite, threatening in its own way. It spoke of violations, of noise, of smells that could be considered intrusive, and of gatherings that might disturb the peace. I read it twice, each word more absurd than the last. I thought about how peace is not silence, it is belonging, and how the smell of smoked brisket was not an offense, but an invitation. Still, the rules said otherwise. At first I tried to push it away. Maybe they were having a bad week, maybe some other neighbor had complained, and they were just passing along the message. Maybe I could reason with them. So I called. I kept my voice calm. I explained how my barbecues were small family friends, nothing wild, and I promised to wrap them up early. But the voice on the other end was cold, certain, as if my words slid off before they could even land. They told me rules are rules, no exceptions. That night I sat outside in the quiet, the grill cold, the chairs empty, the sky stretching wide above me. And I thought about my father. He used to say, a man's home is not just where he lives, it is where he is free to be himself. If you let someone take that freedom, even a little, they will come back for the rest. The more I thought about it, the more the burn in my chest turned into something sharper. I started noticing things, small things, the same board members hosting their own gatherings late into the night, music spilling into the street, cars parked halfway on the sidewalk, no letters in their mailboxes, no folded warnings in their hands. It was not about rules, it was about control, and who they decided to aim it at. And something in me decided that day that I would not be their easy target. The plan did not come all at once. It began as a thought, a what if, a quiet question that kept me awake longer than I wanted. What if I turned their own system against them? What if I made them play by the very rules they used to corner me? The thought grew each time I passed them, each time I saw the smug tilt of their heads, the way they looked at my yard, as if already measuring where they would draw the line. I stopped smiling at them. They noticed. I stopped waving. They noticed more. In the mornings, I walked past their houses and saw things they did not want noticed: peeling paint on a shed, a lawn creeping past the allowed height, a fence leaning just enough to count as unsafe. And every time I saw it, I imagined a letter arriving in their mailbox, folded too neatly with words that sounded polite, but were built to take something away. But I did not act, not yet, not while they could see me coming. Instead, I planned, I waited, I let them think I was tired, defeated, maybe even scared. I nodded when they mentioned rules in passing. I kept my barbecues small enough to avoid attention. But in my mind, each quiet evening was another brick in the wall I was building around my patience, because I knew once I started there would be no turning back. And all the while I could feel the neighborhood watching. Some people whispered support in passing, others kept their distance, afraid to be seen on my side. But I saw their eyes, I heard the longing when they talked about how things used to be, when we could share a meal without wondering if it broke a rule. And I realized this was not just about me or my grill, it was about all of us, and what we were willing to live with. That night, as I sat in the dark yard, the letter still on the table in front of me, I made the decision I would not just fight back. I would make sure they remembered why they should have left me alone. I looked up at the sky and felt the weight lift just a little, because now I had a plan, and soon they would understand. They say the quiet before the storm is the most dangerous. But in my neighborhood, the quiet was almost an announcement. Something was coming. The air felt different each morning, as if the streets themselves were waiting for what I was about to do. I walked past their houses again this time, slower, letting my eyes trace every flaw, every small infraction, the same way they must have done with my yard. But I was not in a hurry. Revenge needs patience. It needs to taste the fear before it serves the justice. One afternoon, I caught one of them watering his lawn in direct violation of the schedule posted by the HOA themselves. He waved, as if nothing was wrong, as if his title gave him immunity. And I smiled back just enough to hide the thought that was forming in my mind. Because I knew then I had them. They were not perfect. They were not untouchable. They were only people who thought no one was watching. Inside my garage, the plan started taking shape. I pulled out my old camera, the one I used to take pictures of family picnics and fishing trips. And I began documenting everything. At first, felt strange creeping around my own neighborhood, with a lens trained on chipped fences, overgrown bushes, trash bins left out past the pickup time. But the more I looked, the more I found. And with each click of the shutter, my anger shifted into something sharper, a kind of satisfaction. Days turned into weeks, and my collection grew like a quiet arsenal. I never confronted them, never mentioned the photos in casual conversation. I just kept smiling, kept waving, letting them believe I had moved on, because the best part of revenge is when they never see it coming. I started reading the HOA bylaws late into the night, memorizing every line, every obscure rule buried in the pages, things no one ever thought about. But everyone was technically bound to obey, and I saw the hypocrisy. Plain as day. Then the next letter came. This time it was bolder. They claimed my last barbecue had been a direct violation, even though I had kept it small, quiet, respectful. It was their way of saying they could push me whenever they wanted. And I realized this was no longer about barbecues at all. It was about showing the neighborhood what happens when you challenge them. And that was when the burn in my chest turned into steel. I would not just fight back, I would make an example. I sent an anonymous note to the HOA office listing a series of complaints about certain properties with attached photographs and detailed citations from the very rulebook they used against me. I made sure the language matched. There's formal, precise, no emotion, just the cold weight of compliance. When the first notice arrived at their own doors, I could almost feel the confusion radiating through the street. They had never been on this side of the letter before, and it shook them. But I was not done. I wanted them to taste the slow crawl of frustration, the way you check your yard twice a day, the way you start seeing flaws that were always there, but never mattered, until someone made them matter. I timed my complaints just right, never too many at once, never obvious enough to point a finger at me, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes two in a single day, always with proof, always with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing the rules were theirs, not mine. Neighbors started talking, whispers at first, then open conversations at mailboxes and sidewalks about how unfair it felt, about how strange it was that the enforcers were now the ones under watch. And I listened without confirming, without denying. Because a good plan works best when the truth is just out of reach. They began canceling their own gatherings, fixing things in a hurry, keeping their heads down, and the power they once carried in their posture seemed to fade with each passing week. One evening, I saw one of them standing in his driveway, staring at the peeling paint on his fence, the same paint I had photographed weeks before, and I knew I had broken something, not just in his fence, but in the certainty he once had that he was untouchable. I thought about saying something, a casual remark about how the rules can be tricky, but I stayed silent, because silence sometimes cuts deeper than words. Still, I kept my own yard perfect, every blade of grass in place, every light fixture secure, every inch within the bounds of their precious bylaws. I hosted small dinners inside the house, windows open, so the smell of barbecue drifted just enough to remind them of what started this, without giving them the satisfaction of another letter they could send to my mailbox. The balance had shifted, and I wanted it to stay that way. I knew they were trying to find out who was behind the complaints. They called special meetings, sent out memos reminding residents to respect the community guidelines. But the harder they looked, the less they found. Because I was careful, meticulous, I left no trail. And in the eyes of the neighborhood, I was just another resident going about my life. But deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The real move was still to come. And when it did, it would not just be about rules or fences or lawns. It would be about making sure they understood that the people they thought they could control were watching and waiting and ready to fight back. And as I sat on my porch that night watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not anger, not fear, but control, real control, the kind you earn, not the kind you take. And I realized that, for the first time since the letter arrived, I was not just defending my home, I was defining it. It was a Friday evening when the idea for the next step came to me, the kind of idea that feels too bold to be safe, but too satisfying to ignore. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind carried the scent of rain, and somewhere deep inside me, something told me it was time to push harder. I had chipped away at them for weeks, but now I wanted the crack to split wide open. I wanted everyone to see what lay beneath their polished smiles and perfect lawns. I began by finding out more about their own houses, not the kind of surface flaws anyone could see, but the deeper things, the kind you only know if you look hard enough. I learned which permits they had skipped, which upgrades were not up to code, which little shortcuts they thought would never catch up with them. And I wrote it all down, not in one list, but in fragments scattered across pages, as if the chaos on paper mirrored the quiet chaos I was about to create. That weekend they tried to host a board meeting at one of their houses, and I watched from my porch as cars pulled in, as people carried clipboards and folders, as if they were about to decide the fate of the world. I waited until the meeting began, then walked slowly past the driveway, just close enough to catch their eyes, but not close enough to invite words. The look they gave me was strange, not the smug certainty I was used to, but something quieter, like they were wondering how much I knew. Later that night, I mailed an envelope, not to them directly, but to the city inspection office, with copies of the things I had found, detailed enough to demand attention, but vague enough to keep my name far from the report. And when I dropped it into the box, I felt that familiar burn in my chest turn into a slow, steady satisfaction. A week later, the first inspector showed up. No one knew who had called them, but everyone saw them walking around the board president's house, pointing at the fence, measuring the patio steps, taking photos with the same deliberate care I had once used. And by the time they left, the street was buzzing with questions. It was no longer about me. It was about them, and the possibility that the rules they used as weapons were now pointed in their own direction. I hosted my first small outdoor gathering in months that weekend. Nothing wild, just a few friends, music low enough to blend with the sound of the wind, and the smell of chicken slow roasting on the grill. The board members drove past more than once, but they did not stop. They did not send a letter. And that was when I knew the power had shifted for good. But I was not ready to stop. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to make sure this never happened again. Not to me, not to anyone else here. So I started talking quietly to neighbors, the ones who had once kept their heads down, the ones who whispered complaints in private. I told them what I had learned about the rules, how they could be used, how no one was above them. And one by one, I saw their expressions change from fear to interest. We began meeting in secret, nothing formal, just quiet talks in kitchens and garages about how the HOA had gone too far, about how they had turned community into control, and how maybe it was time to remind them who they actually served. It was slow, careful work, but it was growing. And for the first time, I felt less like one person fighting alone, and more like the start of something bigger. The board members noticed the shift. They noticed people were not as quick to agree, not as eager to look away. They began sending more notices, more reminders, more thinly veiled warnings. But each one only made the whispers grow louder, because now people had seen the other side. They had seen that the rules could be challenged, and that the ones making them were far from untouchable. Then came the night it all boiled over. The board president confronted me in the street, his voice low but sharp, accusing me without proof, telling me that my little games were over, that they would find out exactly what I had been doing and put an end to it. I stood there in the glow of the streetlight and let him speak. And when he was done, I simply said, "Maybe you should read your own rules again." Then I turned and walked away, leaving him in the silence I knew would follow him home. The next morning, more inspection notices went out, this time not just to the board members, but to a handful of their close allies, the ones who had supported every letter sent to me without question. and I could almost feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. They had built their power on fear, and now that fear belonged to them. That night I sat on my porch again, listening to the faint hum of the street and the smell of smoke from my own quiet barbecue drifting into the air. And I realized this was no longer about revenge. It was about balance, about making sure no one could forget that this was our neighborhood, not theirs to control. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I felt the kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from knowing the fight was worth it. The change started small, almost invisible, like the first hint of wind before a storm. Neighbors who once kept their heads down began to linger a little longer when they saw me in the yard, their voices softer at first, then slowly stronger, telling me stories of the letters they had received, the warnings about paint colors, garden sizes, even the height of their mailboxes. And the more they spoke, the more I saw the cracks spreading through the perfect picture the HOA had tried to paint. It was not just whispers anymore. One afternoon, I saw a group of them standing together at the corner near the mailbox. Their arms crossed, their eyes scanning the street like they were waiting for someone to try and interrupt them. The board president drove past, and I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like the control he once had was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I began helping quietly, nothing official, just advice on what rules could be challenged, where the gray areas were, how to document every visit, every notice, every small act of overreach. People started sending their own letters back to the board, quoting the same bylaws that had been used against them. And each time they did it, the board lost another piece of their authority. Then came the first meeting after the inspections, the one where they had to face the neighborhood in person. I almost did not go, but something told me it was important, so I walked into that room and felt every eye follow me, some with curiosity, some with quiet approval. The board tried to start with business as usual, but it was clear they were on edge. They avoided my gaze, they stumbled over their words. And when the first neighbor stood up to question why the rules seemed to apply differently to different people, I saw them flinch. It was a slow unraveling. At first, questions turned into challenges, challenges turned into demands for transparency, and I stayed quiet, letting others speak, because I knew the less I said, the more they would wonder how much of this I had set in motion. They tried to push back, but the room was no longer theirs. The voices were too many, the mood too different. In the days that followed, the tension only grew. One of the board members put his house up for sale, another stopped showing up at meetings altogether. I kept hosting my quiet barbecues, careful never to break a single rule, but always just visible enough for them to remember why they were losing their grip. The smell of smoke drifting over the fence was no longer a provocation. It was a reminder of everything they had failed to control. The neighborhood felt different now, more alive. People waved to each other again. They borrowed tools. They shared food over fences. And it struck me how quickly fear can dissolve once someone takes the first step to push back. And yet I knew they were not done, not completely. The president still had a hold on a few loyal members, and I could see him trying to rally them, whispering in driveways, sending emails full of warnings about unity and respect for the rules. One evening I found a note on my door, not a formal letter, but a handwritten message telling me to stop before things went too far. No signature, no direct threat. But I knew where it came from, and I laughed quietly to myself, because the words were not from someone in control, they were from someone afraid. And that fear was exactly what I had wanted them to feel from the moment I unfolded that first letter months ago. Still, I did not push too hard. I knew the best way to end this was to let them finish themselves. The more they tried to reassert control, the more they exposed the imbalance in their system. I kept my photos, my notes, my records all tucked away like ammunition I might never need, but was always ready to use. And in the meantime, I focused on strengthening the connections that had formed in the neighborhood. Because power does not just belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the ones who stand together. Then came the day I had been waiting for. A neighbor knocked on my door to tell me about a petition going around to remove the board president entirely. They had enough signatures to call for a vote, and they wanted me to be there when it happened. I agreed without hesitation, knowing this was the moment when all the quiet work, the patience, the planning would finally pay off. That night I sat by the grill watching the flames dance and thought about how far things had come from that first letter to this moment, where the balance of power had shifted entirely, not because I had shouted the loudest, but because I had refused to be silent. And as the smoke curled into the evening air, I knew the fight was not just mine anymore, it belonged to all of us. And that was something the HOA could never take back. The night of the vote felt heavier than any summer storm. The air was thick, with something unspoken, the street unusually quiet, except for the faint sound of footsteps heading toward the community hall. I walked there slowly, feeling the eyes of neighbors watching from porches and windows, some nodding as I passed, some looking away, but all of them knowing why we were gathering tonight. Inside the room, the air was warm, almost stifling. Chairs scraped across the floor as people settled in. The board sat at the front, their faces still and tight, like they had rehearsed their calm in the mirror. The president began speaking, his voice smooth at first, thanking everyone for coming, talking about community unity, tradition. But beneath the surface, there was a tremor, a slight break in the rhythm that told me he could feel the ground shifting under him. The petition was read aloud, the words sharp and clear, each sentence landing like a hammer. Neighbors listened, some leaning forward in their chairs, some with arms folded, waiting for the moment they had been promised. When the time came for discussion, voices rose from the crowd, not angry shouts, but steady, calm accusations, each backed with examples, each one a reminder of how far the board had overstepped. And every time the president tried to answer, someone else stood up with another story, another rule bent for one, and enforced on another. His composure cracked just enough to see the truth. He was not used to being questioned. He was not used to losing control. I said nothing until near the end, when a neighbor I had helped quietly months ago turned to me and asked if I wanted to speak. The room fell silent, all eyes waiting. I stood and let the quiet stretch a moment longer, then spoke simply about fairness, about how rules are only as strong as the trust they are built on, and how once that trust is gone, no rule can hold a community together. I reminded them of the barbecues, the laughter, the connection that had been here before the letters and the fear, and I told them that was worth fighting for. The vote was called, and hands went up one by one, slow at first, then faster. The count was not even close. The president was removed by a margin so wide it could not be argued. Even his closest allies seemed relieved when it was over. And for the first time in months, I saw something in his eyes that had never been there before: defeat. After the meeting, the room felt different, lighter. Neighbors smiled again. Conversations started without the edge of caution. People lingered in the parking lot, talking about what came next, about how to choose new leadership, about how to make sure this never happened again. I walked home alone under the streetlights, the night air cool against my face, and felt a strange mix of victory and calm. But I knew this was not the end, not completely. Power leaves a shadow even when it is gone, and there were still rules that could be twisted, still people who might try to pull the strings. When no one was looking, I kept my files, my photos, my notes tucked away, because a victory is only as safe as the watch you keep over it, and I was not going to let this neighborhood slip back into silence. The former president avoided me. After that, I would see him sometimes walking to his car, eyes down, moving quickly, as if afraid I might stop him and say something, but I never did, because his silence was the best apology I could have asked for, and his absence from the center of the street was the clearest proof that the fight had been worth it. In the weeks that followed, the new board took shape, made of neighbors who had been quiet before, but now stepped forward with ideas for fairness and transparency. They began undoing some of the more absurd restrictions and replacing them with guidelines that felt like they belonged to everyone, not just the few at the top. And every change felt like another step towards something we could actually be proud of. One Saturday afternoon, I hosted my first big barbecue since it all began, the grill smoking from morning till dusk, music drifting through the yard, laughter spilling into the street, neighbors bringing dishes of their own, children running through sprinklers. It felt like the neighborhood I had imagined when I first moved here, the kind of place where no one had to measure their joy against a rule book. I stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, watching it all, and thinking about how close it had come to being lost, about how one letter had almost erased all of this, and how sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to bow their head to turn the tide. And as the sun began to set, painting the street in gold, I knew we had done more than remove a president. We had taken back our home. I should have known it was not over, not completely, because people like him do not just fade away, they wait in the shadows, they look for cracks in the wall. And when they find one, they push hard enough to make it seem like the wall was never strong at all. It started quietly, small rumors whispered from porch to porch about how the new board was unprepared, how they would let the neighborhood fall apart, how rules were there for a reason. And without them, everything would slip into chaos. At first I ignored it because rumors are like smoke, they drift, they fade, but this smoke was starting to gather. One evening I overheard two neighbors talking by the mailbox. They said he had been meeting with a few of his old allies, not in the open, but in backyards behind closed garage doors. And my gut told me exactly what was happening. He was planning a way back, not through a vote this time, but through doubt and division. He wanted people to miss the order he claimed to have kept, even if that order came at the cost of freedom. I decided not to confront him, yet because confrontation would only feed his narrative. Instead, I started listening more closely, paying attention to where the rumors started and where they landed. And the pattern was obvious. They always came from the same few voices, the same houses, the same quiet network he had built when no one was paying attention. So I began visiting those neighbors, not to argue, but to talk, to ask about their concerns, to listen and remind them of what it had been like before the change and how much better things were now. The more I spoke to them, the more I saw the cracks in his plan, because while fear is powerful, memory is stronger. And people remembered the letters, the warnings, the way their lives had been measured in inches and decibels. They remembered how the laughter in their yards had been replaced by silence, and how that silence had lifted the moment the vote was won. Still, he tried one last play. A letter slid into every mailbox, not from the board, but unsigned, accusing the new leadership of ignoring violations, of letting property values drop, of turning the neighborhood into something unrecognizable. It was written in that same polite but sharp tone I knew too well, and it carried just enough truth to make people uneasy. That night, the street felt different. Conversations were shorter, glances sharper, like the air just before a storm breaks. I knew I could not let it linger, so I called a gathering, not in the hall, but in my backyard where all of this had begun. I lit the grill, set out chairs, invited everyone. No speeches, just food and space. To talk one by one, they came, some curious, some cautious. And as the smoke rose into the night, we talked about what the neighborhood had been, what it had become, and what we wanted it to be moving forward. I did not have to name him because everyone already knew who had written the letter. By the end of the night, the tension had shifted, the air lighter, the voices stronger. People were no longer wondering if the new board could lead. They were remembering why the old one had to go. And as the last of them left, I saw the relief in their eyes, because they knew the decision they had made had been the right one, and no unsigned letter could change that. A few days later, word spread that he was putting his house on the market, this time for real. No whispers, no rumors, just a sign in the yard. The same kind of sign that had once felt like an escape for neighbors who could not stand the pressure anymore. I watched him load boxes into his car, avoiding my eyes. And I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. His fight was over, and he knew it. The neighborhood slowly settled again, the quiet this time, not the silence of control, but the peace of choice. The board kept working to make things fair, to keep the rules as a guide, not a weapon. And the backyard barbecues became more than just food. They became a reminder that this was our space, our home, and no one could take that away without a fight. That night, as I sat by the grill, flames low, the scent of smoke curling into the cool air, I thought about how far we had come, and how close we had been to losing it all. And I realized that victory is not just about winning, it is about keeping watch, because freedom left unattended will always attract those who want to own it. And I knew I would never stop watching. People thought I fought the HOA because of a grill, because of some ribs and the smell of smoke on a summer night. But that was never the whole truth. The truth was deeper, older, rooted in something I carried long before I moved here, long before any letter slid into my mailbox. My father used to say, a home is the last line between you and the world outside. It is the one place you should never feel like a guest. I grew up watching him fight to keep that space for us, sometimes against landlords, sometimes against City rules sometimes against neighbors who thought they knew better. And every time he stood his ground, he did it with the same quiet steel that had started to grow in me the moment I unfolded that first letter. I had promised myself a long time ago that when I finally had a place of my own, one would be able to take a piece of it without a fight, and yet, that was exactly what they had tried to do. The letter was just paper, but paper carries weight when it is backed by power. And the way they looked over my fence that day told me they thought I would fold the way so many others had before me. Maybe that is why I stayed so calm, why I took my time planning. Because this was never about one night around the grill. This was about a promise I had made to myself and to the people I lived among. When the neighborhood started to stand with me, it was not just a win, it was a kind of validation proof that what my father taught me still mattered, that you do not have to shout to be heard, you just have to stand and keep standing until the ground beneath you feels steady again. I thought about the nights I sat alone on the porch watching the quiet street and wondering if it was worth it, wondering if maybe giving in would be easier. And now I was glad I never listened to that voice, because the easy road would have left this place smaller, colder. Sometimes I walk past the house where the former president used to live, and I imagine the weight he must have carried when the signs of his control started slipping. I wonder if he ever thought about what it felt like for the rest of us to live under that kind of watch. If he ever realized that what he called order was just fear in a polite envelope. Maybe he did, maybe that is why he left, or maybe he still believes he was right. But the beauty of it is that it does not matter anymore, because the neighborhood is not his to define. The new board still sends notices sometimes when something truly needs attention, but they come with explanations, with offers to help. And when they walk by your yard, they wave, they ask how you are, they do not measure your grass before they ask about your day. It is a small thing, but small things add up in these days. When I light the grill, I do not scan the street for who might be watching, I just cook and laugh, and let the smoke rise without wondering if it will bring another folded letter to my. The kids in the neighborhood have started calling my place the barbecue house, and it makes me smile, because that is what it should be known for, not as the place where a fight started, but the place where people came together again. I see parents relaxing instead of glancing at their watches, worried about some unspoken curfew. I hear the kind of laughter that carries down the street and bounces off the houses, and I think about how empty this street would sound if we had all decided to stay quiet. I know there will always be rules here, there will always be someone willing to test the edges of them. But now there is also a memory, a shared story of what happens when those rules stop serving the people they are meant to protect. And that memory is stronger than any bylaw. I keep my notes, my photos, my files, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for what it took to get here. Because history has a way of repeating itself when no one remembers how hard the first fight was. Some nights I sit by the grill after everyone has gone home, the coals cooling, the night air settling in. And I think about my father, about the way he would stand in the doorway after a long day watching the street, like it was something he was responsible for, like it was part of who he was. And I understand him more now than I ever did then. Because I feel the same way about this place. I'm not just protecting my yard. I am protecting the space where we live, where we breathe, where we are free to be exactly who we are without permission. There is a moment at the end of every fight when the noise fades and the dust settles, and you find yourself standing in the quiet wondering if it was worth it for me. That moment came on a warm evening with the sky painted in streaks of orange and gold, the grill sending up a lazy curl of smoke, the kind that drifts not with urgency, but with confidence. Neighbors were scattered around the yard, plates in their hands, laughter cutting through the air like music. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I was not thinking about what the HOA might say tomorrow or next week. I was just here in this moment. Kids darted between chairs, chasing each other through the grass, the smell of ribs and chicken mixing with the faint sweetness of flowers from the garden someone had planted just that spring, and every sound, every scent felt like proof that the fight had been worth it. The letters, the quiet planning, the long months of pushing back, all of it had led to this, a place where no one flinched when they heard footsteps at the fence, where no one saw their home as something that could be taken away with a folded piece of paper. I caught myself looking toward the end of the street, where the former president's house used to stand, now replaced by new neighbors who waved every time they passed. And it hit me how quickly things can change, how the power that once seemed unshakable had crumbled the moment people decided it did not belong to one man, but to everyone here. And I thought about how easy it would have been to let that first letter slide, to tell myself it was not worth the trouble, and how much smaller my life would be now if I had. The sun dipped lower, the light turning softer, shadows stretching across the lawn, and I felt that familiar pull to reflect on what it all meant, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been told to stay in their place. The truth is, the fight is never just about the thing that starts it. It is about the line you draw, and the choice to hold it even when it would be easier to step back. It is about knowing that if you let someone take one small piece of your freedom, they will come back for the rest, and about how the smallest acts of defiance can grow into something powerful when others see them and join in. I thought about the faces of the neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up, now standing here laughing, talking, making plans for the next gathering without looking over their shoulders. I thought about how trust once lost is not easy to rebuild, but how worth it is when you do. And I realized that this street, this little stretch of homes and yards, had become more than just a place to live. It had become a place to belong. And that is something no bylaw can create or destroy. As the night deepened, and the first stars appeared above the rooftops, I knew the story was over. But the lesson would stay the same. Sometimes you have to be the one who refuses to bend. Sometimes you have to stand in the path of what feels inevitable and show it that you will not move. And sometimes you have to fight, not because you enjoy the battle, but because you know what will be lost if you do not. The grill hissed softly as the last of the flames died down. The chairs slowly emptied, the laughter drifting away with the footsteps down the street. And I stayed out there a little longer, alone, in the glow of the porch light, looking at the yard that had once been the reason for a war, and was now just a yard again, the kind of yard where memories are made, where people gather, where the only smoke is from the fire you build with your own hands, and not from the burn of someone else's control. When I finally went inside, I left the windows open so the cool night air could drift through, carrying with it the faint scent of barbecue that had become the scent of freedom in this neighborhood. And I thought to myself that maybe that was the real revenge, not the letters, not the votes, not even the victory, but the simple, unshakable truth that we had taken back what was ours and made it better than it had ever been. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.